The room. All right, so welcome back, everyone, to our second session for the Light Festival today. Thank you for coming in on the first one about dance, the color white with Corday. And here we are for our second session titled Speculative Fiction, Care Work, and Imagining After Empire, a storytelling workshop. And we have the pleasure of having Dr. Dharushana Muthulingam with us today. She said we can call her D. Is that okay?
Yes, definitely.
Awesome, awesome. So, D, well, again, brief intro. So I'm Tammy, Dr. Tammy Joe, taking on moderating the session along with Alexis. And a little bit about Dee. So Dee is an MD. She's a writer, teacher, and infectious disease physician who focuses on sex, drugs, and microbes. So she writes and speaks about science, care work, labor, empire. Um, that's So she's talking about labor, empire, cultural history of medicine, and speculative narrative. She has served as faculty here at Washington University um, in St. Louis, the School of Medicine here, and at the School of the Alternative, with writing in Vogue online, Logic with an S, The Drift, and elsewhere. So forthcoming adventures for her include Teen House Summer Workshop and an essay collection about infectious cryptozoology, body horror, the Lankan Tamil diaspora, among other things. Oh wow, that is yeah. We are excited to hear more from you. Um, as an infectious disease physician, as an expressive narrative writer. So we're excited to have you here. So if people could take a minute to welcome Dr. D. All right. So for the workshop today, we are looking at how we reconsider storytelling as a liberatory practice, right? As a freeing practice with a focus on narrative time travel, because we're talking about space, so we're thinking about the space-time continuum here. We are going to probe the limits of the conventions of narrative medicine, um, the hero's journey, and popular science fiction tropes. Then we will stock our rucksacks to explore beyond this, drawing from the works of Ursula K. Le Guin, Viet, so just pardon me with the names, I apologize ahead of time, Viet Thanh Nguyen,
Mhm.
embodiment practices, the Afrofuturists, and Grace Dillon's Indigenous Slipstream. Then we would play with memory, knowledge, and imagining. And in this play of ours, we will reclaim how truly vast the possibilities are in our bodies and communities, and also embrace story's power for collective world building. So I will pause here and hand this over to Dee to take us through her preparation for us today.
Thank you so much for the intro. I swear this is not just word jumble. Some of these things will get connected. Definitely never lacking for ambition. Let me put this into slideshow. Okay, you guys got that. All right. Thank you for the intro and for your time for signing into Zoom on a Saturday morning. I'm so appreciative of your presence. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about storytelling and sort of how that builds into sort of how we think about public health. So I am an infectious disease doctor and I did public health research for a very, very, very long time and kind of still do. All right. So I'm going to talk My pitch was maybe more expansive, but in our time, we'll talk about speculative storytelling and imagination, especially what it looks like after empire. So to open this up, I just want to sort of set the tone. So we're going to take a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown and all of her excellent work, but she argues all organizing is science fiction. We are shaping the future we long for and have not yet experienced. So not everybody is a science fiction fan, but I think there is something to work through here that can take us to a more expansive understanding of how we do our work. Okay, I know it's Saturday morning, but just work with me here. If you have a piece of paper or like a text box to open, I want you to just do this exercise. It will just be 1 minute. So I want you to imagine the year is 2064, and you and your descendants are living your day-to-day life in your community. The healthcare in that system was built by you this year. So you were invited to draw on your talents, your experiences, the people you know, and you were asked to imagine and design that system of care. And that system of care has come to fruit in 2064 for you, maybe your children, your grandchildren. So take a minute to just ask, what does this healthcare look like? How are the bodies of the society cared for? How is the collective health, the social body, the public body cared for? Just give you 1 minute so you can draw it, just write down like 3 things or think of it in your head as you're multitasking. What would a healthcare that you designed for your own descendants look like and feel like? I'll give you a minute. All right, I'm going to call you back. And I just want you to hold that. And if I time this correctly, we'll come back to this in a minute. But that future projection or design or imagination that you have. So let's see. So this is loosely the outline that I'm going to talk about. And hopefully we'll get to everything and adjust as needed. So first I'm going to talk about storytelling, and then I'll talk about time travel and futures, and then I'll talk about a very specific couple of ideas, especially in Indigenous Slipstream and how we use that for doing our work. And then very briefly, I'll talk about the body and world building. I will make these slides available. There's a lot of really amazing art, and they are all cited, so you can access those afterwards. So storytelling is world building. So in certain corners of the popular culture, there's a lot about stories. It probably started in the 70s. There was a lot of like French literary theory, but it kind of made its way into pop culture. And now everything is story. Brands are not brands, they're brand stories. And I'll include some references. But for our purposes today, if you can just hold with me a sort of very simple provisional definition. So I'm going to call a story an account of a linked series of events. And then I want to propose a model for the purpose of story. Anyone who works in science knows that no model is accurate, but some models are useful. So this is not a rigorous sort of proposition, but it is sort of a loose framework and that we can play with and test and see if it fits. And my proposition is storytelling is necessary to problem solve and to coordinate with other people in order to solve problems. To make this case, I'm going to talk about a recent paper. It is a mouse study. And I just want to say about mice is that they're incredibly sophisticated animals. And really all mammals are. Mammals are incredibly plastic. We tend to have these incredibly rich social structures and organizations. And we are really good at surviving. So this is the study from a couple of years ago. Oh, I didn't put a date, but you can ask me for the link. I am not a neuroscientist. If you are, feel free to jump in and give me feedback. But this is my very loose outline of sort of what they found in that study. Basically, mice, just like us, have a hippocampus and it holds a cognitive map of the actual spatial world. In this study, they trained the mice and implanted electrodes in that region, and they were able to develop a code basically of certain electrical brain activity correlated to the animal's position in a virtual maze. So when the animal was in that position, then the parts of the brain would light up in a certain pattern. What they found is, and this is not a novel finding, is that the rats would activate that map even when they were not in that position in the virtual maze. And that is a known thing, that they will recall where we are. And I think there's human studies too, is we have memory of space and it will light up the same pattern as if we are there. The novel finding was that the rats would start activating spaces to places in the maze they had not been. So they were manipulating the map in their minds and then kind of creating what if situations and trying to fill in the gaps. And that was the big novel finding. And from multiple studies, we know that rats will tell their friends where the cheese is. And sometimes we don't even know the mechanism of how they communicate that because they're not in the same space. So this is not scientific. Things can get very sloppy when you try to import like scientific testing into like literature, but bear with me here. This is my proposition. Storytelling is about that memory. So you have to have that information, the data, the learning, the experience, and you go over it and you turn it over and you examine it. You then project into the future about what to do next. You link memory to possibilities. And it's almost like this workbench where you're working out what to do next. And most importantly, you tell your friends where the cheese is, and sometimes you work together to find it. That has a lot of implications. If you intervene on memory or you intervene on imagination of what parameters are possible, that's a lot of power. So then it turns you into saying, well, how do we think about story in our culture? And I won't belabor this a lot, but there's a lot of limitation to the conventions of popular storytelling. And you may have heard of the hero's journey. It's a big part of especially screenwriting and television writing. Joseph Campbell was a writer in the 1940s. He really came to popularity when George Lucas cited him in as part of writing Star Wars. And sort of it's this idea that there's this individual hero and it's inevitably a he, goes on this long journey. And that's, if you look at a lot of movies, if you look at Frozen, Disney movies, there's often this pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The thing is, Joseph Campbell proposed that this was like a summary of all the myths and folktales of the world, and that was just not accurate. He leaves out a lot. And some of the criticism is that this is a very individualist story. So everybody else is kind of a friend or an enemy or a victim, but it's really about this one guy going through. It centers conflict to drive the story. And it's an artifact of the 20th century, which is that it feeds the great man myth, that it's this rugged individual in the world, sort of conquering it and maybe having some internal evolution. So that's just one story, but it dominates kind of our popular storytelling, and the alternatives are vast. Storytelling is bigger than just text. You can tell stories in poetry, music, theater, dance, film, and you can also tell stories in non-textual ways. And so a lot of times you don't have the ability to write, or you're not allowed to write. And so a lot of cultures, women were often the tapestry makers, and their stories built into those tapestries, or in hair adornments, there would be secrets or maps, and there are many ways to communicate that. And not everything is a story. We also make incantations, analysis, argument. Those are all available to us. Within text, you can do novels, you can have multiple voices, and then this is where I come in, which is you can have nonlinear narratives that kind of break up how we think about the world. And so one of those is time travel. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about time travel and the future. So this is kind of an artifact of just like how I grew up. I got really into science fiction. I got into Star Trek. So this is what I'm working with. So Robert Heinlein is a famous science fiction writer. He had this story that was or novella that was published, and it was very popular. It was like this guy, he enters the portal, he goes back and forth in time, and then gets kind of caught up in these like time loops and paradoxes. And it's very delightful as a puzzle, it's kind of fun. Grace Dillon, who I'll talk about it, called this framework of time travel sort of the extrapolative fiction. And you think of it as a mathematical equation, and you start at a point, and then you have an arrow that you follow. And maybe that arrow goes forward and maybe it goes backwards, but then you start traveling along that arrow. And the characteristics of this is that it's very much linear time, and it's a specific sense of causality. And what I mean by that is it's like the sort of physics, mechanical Newtonian physics sense of causality. One billiard ball hits another billiard ball. And that kind of is how we think of it generally, but there were other conceptions if you go back to Aristotle. So this is from a video about like the physics of time travel. It's very delightful, but these are some popular movies that you can see that have this time travel element. So, there might be these branch points. And then if you go back, then you get a loop. And then you try to go back before the branch points. I do recommend this movie Primer. It's very complicated. It's very fun. That kind of takes it to this whole other level. So the main thing that Grace Dillon points out about this paradigm of storytelling is that the starting point, this is where the story starts, but the starting point is here. This is where the story starts, but T0 is here. It's kind of arbitrary, except that it's not, because it's a choice. Somebody wrote the story and they picked the starting point. And this really matters because whether your story starts in 1776 or 1619, you have a different story. How do you decide if the story starts in 1948 or 1975 or October 2023? Your starting point determines what arrows of causalities you can see. And that's really powerful because causality also underpins our system of morality, our systems of accountability and justice. So to erase the past is to profoundly reshape the story. So besides that, there's also another limitation to what kind of time travel stories we can tell, which is who gets to time travel. This is a 2019 film, See You Yesterday. I think it's still on Netflix. And it starts off sort of like with two kids, they make a time machine, they're trying to get a scholarship, like pretty typical conventions. But then what happens is one of the characters' brothers is murdered by the police. And now they're trying to use the technology to try to undo that police murder. They keep trying to travel back to one of these branch points to change the outcome of the story. And they go back over and over and over trying to figure that out. So Maya Rudolph is a culture critic, and she reviewed this movie, and she talks about how time travelers in most of these popular movies are almost always white and frequently male. And that's because in stories like Back to the Future, The Time Traveler's Wife, The Butterfly Effect, the scale of personal narrative, the white protagonist is insulated from the larger marginalization and the larger racial history. Alternatively, in stories like 12 Monkeys, The Terminator, Time Cop, the central conflict is so large, apocalypse, dystopias, disasters, that the narrative gets kind of swept away. You don't even have to deal with issues of race. And then as for forward time traveling, the future tends to be surprisingly post-racial, as evinced in Star Trek and Doctor Who. So this issue of racial marginalization, which impacts the majority of people on Earth in these very popular dominant cultural exports, is completely written out of these narratives. And there's implications for that. And so in See You Yesterday, they're constantly trying to adjust the variables to sort of find that branch point into the future. This cyclical sorrow, the movie seems to say, is the state and cost of institutional racism in America. Though time travel narratives so often allow white protagonists to freely jump the timeline, there's an open field of possibilities for the genre to look at history through the eyes of the oppressed, forgotten, and marginalized. What See You Yesterday asserts is that for a people hindered by prejudice and police brutality, the future is a privilege. See you yesterday, CJ's brother tells her solemnly near the end of the film. For these Black travelers, there are only yesterdays to contend with, Tomorrow is just after reach. In our scenarios of time travel, the marginalized or how they are marginalized, how it affects them is always off screen. And this is not isolated to this particular film genre or trope. Alondra Nelson is a scholar who argues this is actually widespread in our storytelling. And that includes our visual arts, our literature, and maybe the most influential of all, in our advertisement. So Alondra Nelson was actually looking at ads for the internet and, the first round of technofuturism in the late 90s and early 2000s. And she really noticed that there's a pattern that in the future, the body wouldn't bother us any longer. I think in 2024, we recognize some of these patterns and their consequences. And they often really posit a similar sort of end of social identities. It's always individualist. It's always unfettered by the past and sort of a very libertarian tint. And her argument is that this has actually been a long strand of 20th century and even prior history. So if you look at Timothy Leary and sort of the utopist mid-century, the 60s and 70s, it's also sort of this free, whimsical, do whatever you want. And then if you go back even further to the turn of the 20th century, the futurists, the Italian futurists, had these manifestos that they were like, leave behind the crypts of the past and look to the future, which is all about trains and buildings and cities. It's always about severing yourself from the past. And associated that is like certain connotations, sometimes explicit and sometimes not, that there's this binary. When Nelson was looking at everything about African-American communities and access to technology was about the digital divide. In other settings, it's really contrasting the primitive past versus the modern future with all of the implications. And then Griffith Rolifson says more explicitly, black magic versus white science. And the scholar Lisa Nakamura kind of argues that internet advertising is visually cleansed of its divisive, problematic, tragic connotation. The ads function as corrective text for readers deluged with images of racial conflicts and bloodshed, both at home and abroad. These advertisements put the world right. And it sort of recapitulates colonial Western powers as a source of knowledge and technology, and all the colonized as sort of the ones that must be civilized and pulled into the future. So this is where Afrofuturism and other types of futurisms come in. This word is attributed to a white culture critic, but it was a very reductive framework. So Alondra Nelson is really credited for one of the early folks that made a framework for Afrofuturism. I am not a scholar of this any more than I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm going to speak very narrowly. It is a vast trove of just music, film, art, urban design over many, many decades, and I'm focusing on a tiny piece of that. Nelson argues that Du Bois, when he talks about the multiplicity of the self, has already challenged that idea of the individual subject, because those who are marginalized do not see their experience reflected. So they take on that individual self, but then they have the double consciousness of knowing what is actually around them. The canonical text of science fiction in Afrofuturism is probably Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo. It's just a delightful novel. He's an incredible writer, very prolific. And he says that he uses necromancy, using the past to explain the present and to prophesize about the future. So in contrast to the neo-critics, Ishmael Reed argues that the necromancer used to lie in the guts of the dead or in the tombs to receive visions of the future. This is prophecy. The Black writer lies in the guts of old America, making readings about the future. And in sort of evoking, sort of calling back the past, you also dispense with binaries. So Rolifson would pull together these sort of tropes and try to combine them to create a new synthesis, so voodoo robots. So I also want to say, in thinking about binaries and what is the science of the science fiction, I think it's worth calling back Ursula Guin, who articulated some of these, what is science? Science is first, above all else, is finding the patterns of nature. And that is something people have always done. They've always had knowledge about their environment. They figured out patterns, they've made observations, and they shared those findings, laws, and theories. Medicine, before it was institutionalized and gatekept, is fundamentally care work. Before you can have antibiotics and insulin, you need somebody who's going to change your dressings, somebody who's going to do the work for you so that you can rest, somebody who's going to feed you. And technology is first the way the human interface with the material world. It's tools, and animals have tools and we have tools. And Guin has an excellent essay where she says the first tool was a sling to carry the baby. It's the bag to gather the wild oats. And I think it's important to remember these because these are capacities we all have as people and communities, and that they are resources we can all access. And why does this matter? Our friend Noam Chomsky, who is definitely not dead, he's described it as such. Look, part of the whole technique of disempowering people is to make sure that the real agents of change fall out of history and are never recognized in the culture for what they are. So it's necessary to distort history and make it look as if great men did everything. That's part of how you teach people they can't do anything. They're helpless. They just have to wait for some great man to come along and do it for them. Through Afrofuturism, there's a way in which we shift away from looking at sort of the Western hegemony, like the dominant storytelling, and sort of call on looking at through, she's talking about Reed's novel, calling back African diasporic experience. And it's weighted by the past, or sorry, it is rooted in the past, but it's not weighed down. It's continuous and becomes something else. And there's a future. We're not trapped in the past. And this is kind of the study that Grace Dillon sort of bounces off from in Indigenous Futures. So in 2012, she put together this anthology of Indigenous speculative fiction and sort of developed some of this thinking. So it might, I'm going to try my best with pronunciation. It might go without saying that all forms of Indigenous futurisms are narratives of Biskabiang, an Anishinaabe word connoting the process of returning to ourselves, which involves discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt to our post-native apocalypse world. And so it isn't that we erase the past, but it isn't that we are stuck in our trauma. And it's also imagines a future, that there are Indigenous people in the future, there are Black people in the future. And what decolonization isn't like trying to undo something that is not undoable, but to build a new future that is rooted in the things that are available to us, including our ancestors and history. So I want to come back to the apocalypse part that Dillon talks about. And I think, you know, I'm an infectious disease doctor, so this is what I'm going to focus about. But there's a lot of pieces during the COVID-19 pandemic about sort of apocalypse and probably also processing climate catastrophe. And there was some pushback. So Ryan Pohl wrote, pandemics are not novel interruptions into the world. Rather, pandemics are one of the defining features of Indigenous history since the onset and expansion of European colonialism. I include Stephen Thrasher's book because he does include chapters, but there's a lot of scholarship on this. So One Person Man talks about Columbus. It's hard to overstate how profound the impact of the movement of biomass in colonialism is. You have brought people, animals, and plants from an entire one continent to an entirely different ecology that has not encountered it and evolved completely separated, that does not have immunity to the pathogens. And then you're importing people from another continent and you're just moving people around, and animals and plants. And this had a profound impact on the Americas. It's estimated that 75% of the people who lived here were killed primarily by infectious disease. And Mann says, in the annals of human history, there is no comparable demographic catastrophe. And I think people are more receptive to this idea than they have been in the past when I talked about it. But, you know, the scholar Chelsea Hayth we often put like colonization, genocide, displacement, marginalization as things that happened in the past. And at best, we're dealing with the consequences of that. But that's not the case at all. These are ongoing apocalypses. These are ongoing marginalization, and they are shaping people right now. These are the same processes. And so it isn't that there's dystopias, apocalypse, and utopias on this timeline, and there's a past and a present and a future. They're actually layered on top of each other, and they interlock, and they are happening all at once. And like so much else in public health, it's really about the distribution. So how do you imagine futures amid apocalypse? So I'm going to talk about Indigenous Slipstream, but I need to say, if you Google Slipstream, it's attributed to these cyberpunk writers, Richard Dorset and Bruce Sterling from 1989. And they were kind of describing the fiction of the 60s and 70s, which included Ursula K. And they call it kind of like weird, sort of not mainstream slipstream. And this kind of science fiction was kind of sort of wobbles in realism, alternative realities. I think now literature really likes to talk about thin places and liminal spaces and really these surreal stories, and the prototypes are Kafka and Borges. Grace Dillon says that is total erasure. That before this, that in the 1970s, Gerald Vizenor and Diane Glancy created the Slipstream Press because nobody would accept their stories. And they were kind of this type of experimental fiction that was very surreal and strange. And this was not included in that collection, but the story Custer in the Slipstream is sort of a very good example of this. So I'll come back to that. So the way Grace Dillon characterizes Indigenous Slipstream is one of the big features is that the past, present, or future are not on a neat, tidy, linear arrow. It's happening all at once. There's nonlinear time, there's multiplicity, and what she describes as sort of interlaced spirals. So you don't have a trajectory of an arrow, you actually have a landscape. And I think one of the most compelling, like contemporary versions of this is the short story Arrival by Ted Chiang, or it's also a huge blockbuster movie. And I think that might capture some of this. Native Slipstream use time as past, present, yes? Oh, was that a question? Okay. That flow together like currents in a navigable stream. It's also dynamic. All temporalities are alive and palpable in the here and now. The second big component is that space-time is a continuum. And contemporary physics kind of also states that, but I think there's a distinction between what we do in physics and sort of what is the notion of space-time in our politics, in our metaphysics. It's still very much this Newtonian conception of mechanical parts that you can take in and out that are fungible. But Dillon argues that history is experienced in and through place, through land. And she talks about that alienation from place, from nature, from the rich, robust, more than human narratives, is one of the defining properties of Western colonial capitalism. The dominant epistemology of colonial capitalism imagines time as an empty, homogeneous category deracinated from place and nature. Moreover, this hollowed out conception of time, bankrupting time of its sacred narratives and interspecies connections. There's also like a whole story about how clock time came to be, and it had to do with like the British Empire being able to dock at multiple longitudes in its empire. Anyway, becomes reduced to a linear narrative. In colonial capitalism, time is imagined as an arrow hurtling violently away from the past, piercing through the present and rushing towards a myopically conceived future. And so in a story like Custer in the Slipstream, you push back against that. So Vizenor writes Custer as not just this George Armstrong Custer, this notorious genocidal figure, as somebody who actually recurs. And in his story, he's Farley Border, who's like this bureaucrat at the United States Department of Labor. And his role is to, quote, serve the tribal people and the poor. And so ostensibly, this is to help, but it ends up being another type of way to control people. Crazy Horse also recurs, and he is quoted saying, "Now all the original people on our Mother Earth go through white men and stand in lines for everything." I don't get to talk about this as much as I want because my time is limited, but this is a very rich literature in that there's a lot of stuff talking about how when you do conquest, it's actually very high resources to send an army and violently conquer people. But once you've done it, you have the administrative apparatus that can administer the control being backed by the violent force. And it dissipates and obscures the violence. And this is what Hannah Arendt's banality of evil kind of talks about, but she also talks about the boomerang theory, which is that empires will experiment with strategies of control in the colonies and then import them back into the imperial centers. So it started off in the colonies and then came back to Europe. And bureaucracy is a means of control. It diffuses resistance. This is an excellent book. David Graeber, just an excellent anthropologist and scholar, also wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. That there's this inverse relationship between what is useful and what gets paid for. So the caring classes, so when you think about medicine, education, childcare, they provide the most useful work in society, and yet it is often unpaid and heavily regulated by administration. And he makes the point that you make a cup once, but you wash it 1,000 times, yet our whole economics is oriented towards production. And then you get this administrative realism where you feel like you have, like, it just reinforces itself. And anybody who has submitted an NIH grant knows that. Excellent novel. They tell you that injustice is part of some grand plan, and that's what keeps you from rising against it. So this is even a more violent severance of past and present or any sense of narrative reason at all. It just becomes a bunch of rules. So Wisner came up with this idea of survivance, that survival is more than endurance or mere response of the cataclysmic traumas that people experience. So Dillon writes, native slipstream is a form of survivance. While indigenous genocide remains a forceful tide in native slipstream narratives, such narratives typically find alternative tides that offer glimpses of geographies unmarked by colonial capitalism. This is really powerful and important. So erasure of the past is to insist there is no recurring pattern, to insist that nothing happened here. And the only possibilities are these branch points, not a whole landscape or web. It narrows your imagination. And to insist that this is the story, not the things you see with your own eyes and the things that your grandparents tell you, which is, you know, a lie. And these are not abstractions relevant to only the domain of like entertainment. These narratives shape the movement of significant resources. So recently there's been a move to decolonize global health. This is an excellent paper by Bump and Aniebo that, you know, says that discourse is extremely superficial without knowing its history. It's not possible to decolonize without understanding what is colonial in the first place. So let's see how briefly I can go through their excellent argument. So they focus on malaria science, and they point out the history is intimately tied with colonial projects. And the reason the empires were invested in malaria is because they were killing their troops. So colonial armies had like 50% mortality rates when they tried to move inland from the coast of West Africa. And so a lot of the early scientific developments, you know, the isolation of Plasmodium, discovery of mosquito transmission, were done by physicians in the French and English militaries. And so after that, they established the schools of tropical medicine, which are really the roots of our current contemporary schools of public health. And those were established in the imperial centers. They were established in London, in Boston, in Paris. They were funded by shipping companies who stood to profit from the expansion of colonial trade. And the thing is, we already know how to eliminate malaria before this because we did it. Because there was malaria in southern England, southern US, and we knew that it was swamp drainage, clean water, protective housing, hygiene, nutrition, and there is no malaria in southern England. But in these schools, there's a real focus on this prestige apparatus that required a lot of infrastructure. We focused on bacteriology, parasitology, entomology. This devalued local knowledge. This is an emphasis on products produced elsewhere. This is still true of the literature. It's all focused on medications, bed nets, vaccines, genetically modified mosquitoes, not land management. And this is an excellent Searing paper about the funds. There's billions in malaria, but 81% of those go back to institutions in rich countries. It goes to WashU, it goes to Harvard, or it goes to NGOs that are also based in rich countries, and less than 1% goes to the countries that are most affected by the illness. I won't even get into that. Okay. Most importantly, it erases the causal role of colonialism, that it was the labor conscription and forced migration that exposed naive populations to populations that had infection. There's large-scale agricultural practices, irrigation and dams, and that was what happened in England and the southern US. You create vector breeding sites like the Mississippi, which is heavily engineered. You inflict poverty and malnutrition, which increases susceptibility to infectious disease. And you took the land. This is land that the indigenous people lived on because it was habitable, and now you force them to move into places that they had previously avoided. When you erase this starting point, you already have not very good problem solving. Okay. It takes a lot of effort to try to mislead so many people about the truth of our own body, of our memories, and what the people we love tell us. So I am Sri Lankan Tamil. There was a multi-decade war there. It ostensibly ended in 2009 when hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced, internally displaced, and concentrated into a no-fire zone. The military then backed them into a very small strip of beach. They had no cover, and then they shelled them relentlessly. And that is now increasingly acknowledged as a genocide of the Tamil people. And it was committed by arms and training that was provided by the US, the United Kingdom, and Israel. So when I watch what happens in Gaza, how could I not remember that? How could I not know that pattern deep in the body? It's a thin place in the slipstream. So when I read about Sudan, Congo, Tigray, how could you not see the pattern? And in science, when we tell our own stories about science or architecture, we talk about Hippocrates, that these 1,000-year-old patterns are relevant to how we conduct our science today. How could we not say the same about imperial strategies of conquest, division, and manipulation? I'm going to go back. So I think when we hear our institutions to whom we have poured our deeply felt labor of care in public health and justice, and we talk about life and health and justice and DEI, but they say nothing about Palestine, when they say they prosecute their own students for speaking back, when they distract us with bureaucracy or technicalities, this is actually a very old and very consistent strategy. And I'm proposing we take our eyes off the great men, off of the imperial core and its administrators, and turn to each other. And we need to remember and imagine, and we have to tell each other our stories to build this new world. If you don't use your art, channel ancestors, think of your descendants. If we're not telling our own story, it will be told for us. This is Audre Lorde. She has an excellent essay I will link, and she talks about eros in this old way, from the Greek word, the personification of love, born of chaos, and it's really the creative power, which is also the Freudian conception of eros versus the death drive, thanatos. This is really I wish I could do a deeper dive in this, but this is my current area of inquiry, connecting storytelling and community to the body, which is very interesting as a physician. I'm a former dancer and just living in contemporary society. That desire and pleasure is part of knowing the body, respecting the body as a finely tuned, wise perceiver and communicator as the alternative to the propaganda. And if you don't know what good feels like, what are you working towards? How will you even know if you get there? And that's why it matters to imagine the futures. Okay. We're coming close to the end. I just want to offer this to you, and would love to hear from you in the discussion if you'd like to share. I want you to return to your notes of that health system you imagine, that system of care. I want you to enter the slipstream into the landscape and be in it. What does it feel like to be cared for by this system or to provide that care? Whether your body is strong or vulnerable, being loved, gentle touch, warmth, pleasure, what does that mean to be cared for, being fed? What does it feel like in your body, in all 5 senses? What other experiences does it remind you of? And with that, I will give you time to do that, but we can go back to our discussion, and then maybe later I can put my concluding remarks.
Amazing. Thank you, Dee.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That has been a very, very interesting walk through the use of narrative. I think for me, one word that comes to mind is activism. It comes through from a lot of the examples you featured, and how and also the narrative of challenging the way we think about our space as we talk space time continuum, um, where the value of nonlinear thinking really lies, right? So thank you so much. I'm going to open up the chat for questions so people can leave questions for Dee. I have a few here, and I would moderate as more come in from our audience. All right. So I think for me, the first question here is how did you start this process as a writer? I know you referenced to how you were into science fiction. I recognize some of the examples you pulled up, and it's nostalgic to think about those. But how did you then start to write? Because it's obvious you encountered stories and you saw them in different, expressions, as the way you said. But how did you then come into that process for yourself? And how do you draw on inspiration? Where do you find that inspiration um, going through the process of writing?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a big question and an ongoing journey. I feel like I started as a writer and then went to med school. Yes, and probably shaped by science fiction to enjoy both of those. There's a lot of Star Trek. I think I think art is often like the sciences, it's posted as this sort of like gate kept career or like thing that you need institutional approval for. But art is also just how we cope with life. And I think, I had my own personal struggles. I think when you have that double consciousness, you're confused and you're not seeing your stories reflected back to you. And then you have to like turn to your family and their particular inheritance of trauma and how they process that. And so you turn to whatever art you have as a way to make sense of things. And for me, that was writing and storytelling. And so I returned to writing to sort of integrate that with my medical and scientific career. And I think a lot of the inspiration is from artists. And I think art is not confection or decoration. It is essential for how we will make sense of these things.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Dee. I think another thing that I've been thinking about just listening to your story is then to see, so using this channel of storytelling, of writing, then how is it that you use that um, in the way you interact with the space around you, in your work, in your
Mhm.
community, when it comes to showing support, in teaching. So how have you been able to interweave storytelling into your other spaces, right, where you live, learn, teach, and exist?
Yeah, definitely. I'm so grateful. I work at Vivant Health. Our patients experience a lot of challenges. And I think working in healthcare, anyone can tell you, is very bureaucratic. It's also part of this long culture of colonization and sort of a culture of surveillance and punishment. And I think sitting with people and just being able to like offer them alternative narratives, like,
Mm,
yeah, it's actually crazy that you have to do all these rules and not get the treatment that you need. Like, this is not the best system for care. And so it helps me reevaluate my experience and the experience of patients. And then my area of inquiry now is like, I'm like most people, so disconnected from my body as like a feminine person, as a worker. That's part of the violence. And so like, how do you get back into the body? And so that's something that I'm learning from other artists and studying, and would love to work with you all about it.
amazing. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions here in the chat that we could still touch upon. So, first one from Dr. Juliet, talking about, she said, so you know that erasure of the starting point never leaves us with good storytelling. I concur with that. So, for those that are eager to begin, where do they start from if they want to address that issue of erasure?
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, that's such a good question. So one of the things I propose is starting with your body and reconnecting to like what feels good, what feels bad, and trusting the body. But the other is to turn to the people around you. And so I didn't get to talk about community enough, but turning to your people, and that might be family, and that might be ancestors. And actually, our speaker later, Chriselle Roach, I got from her this whole idea of the archives. We often think of the archives as written, but a lot of what our grandmothers and mothers share is not written. It's, it's dresses or letters or jewelry or stories. And I think we're taught to not regard that as valuable as like, our medical textbooks, but they're incredibly rich. And especially if you are a marginalized person who had to keep secrets and you had to help your family survive, you're not going to be just putting that out there. And so turning to your body, turning to your family, turning to your community in real life is incredibly rich, incredibly powerful.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Just for the sake of time, we would wrap up in like a minute or two, but to give others a chance to ask questions, we have a few comments here in the chat as well. Sheila had said the inheritance of discovery was passed to me from the living elderly. I
Mhm.
had real stories. My great grandmother, my Cherokee, the list, the lawsuits of the land where I belong, which again also for someone like me who is Nigerian, a lot of our history is oral history and transfer of stories. Um, and I guess the other thing is then documenting, because when we talk about erasure, it's like, do we have
Mhm.
the system for documenting? Is it protected? Because we've also seen recent times where there's been active campaigns to erase,
Yeah.
right, documentation of history here and abroad. So I think this again speaks to, I guess, the power of storytelling and the protection of the way we tell our stories as well. Um, so, Dee, before you leave, could you leave us with one word? If there is anything you really want us to walk away with from this
Um,
session, what would that be? Okay, it could be a phrase.
yes, because I'm a good scientific speaker, I'm gonna share my bullet points very quickly because I love a takeaway, but it's like hard to do that. So I think there's no like statistical interpretation, but I think storytelling is essential to survive. We inherit not only trauma, but resources, and they all exist in this space-time like landscape, and it's accessible. Our ancestors and our descendants should inform us. The truth is in our body, in the land, and among each other. The institutions do not serve you. We exist in the future, and the future is radically open. So that's my takeaway. This is just references, if you just some of the citations and links and things like that.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will pass